The evening sky in Des Moines, Iowa, was warm and gentle, but not enough to ease the fatigue Carl felt in his bones. He stood in the middle of the vast farm, his eyes staring distantly at the fields, waiting for the harvest. Everything in his life seemed to be running in the same old cycle, like an old machine that had lost its freshness or excitement. The loneliness inside him couldn't be fixed by daily chores or the brief conversations he had with his wife. And then, on a light rainy morning, an unexpected meeting changed everything. The annual Des Moines Farmers Market was an event Carl never missed. It was a place where he could reconnect with old friends, talk about new crop varieties, or simply chat about the weather and farming issues. But that year it felt different. As he stepped into the seed vendor's booth, his eyes suddenly locked with a young woman. Her long brown hair, calm gaze, and gentle smile made Carl's heart beat a little faster. Her name was Lily, a young widow who had recently moved nearby and had taken over a small farm close to the market. This wasn't their first meeting, but something about it felt different this time. A strange feeling washed over Carl, as if the air around him had suddenly shifted. While everyone else was busy with their own tasks, Carl and Lily stood chatting, their words unintentionally building a bridge between them. She wasn't like the other women in town. She wasn't rushed or demanding. And in her stories, Carl found a resonance he hadn't felt with his wife in years. His wife, Susan, was a kind, patient woman who had always cared for their family. They had married young, like many couples in small rural towns, and their life had mostly revolved around work and daily routines. The long evenings they spent together no longer felt warm, but rather filled with heavy silence, the ticking of the clock, and Carl's sighs. Their marriage was slowly fading into the past, like a book that had been read and closed long ago. With Lily, everything felt like a breath of fresh air. She didn't care about the boring farm stories or outdated events. Every conversation with her made Carl feel rejuvenated, as if he were being reborn in his own life. And despite a hint of hesitation, a part of him couldn't resist that new feeling. A part of Carl realized that what he had found in Lily was something he never even knew he was missing before. Carl knew that this relationship couldn't last if he didn't keep it secret, but a part of him felt this might be his only chance to reclaim the emotions he had lost. Carl, 50 years old, was a farmer living on the outskirts of Des Moines, Iowa. He wasn't the type to easily reveal his emotions. He usually kept everything bottled inside. His life was tied to the vast farmland where he had spent his youth building and developing. Carl's farm wasn't just his livelihood. It was his family's pride. However, over time, life had started to feel dull and lacking in passion, especially in his marriage of over 20 years to his wife, Susan. Susan was a capable, patient woman who took care of everything in the household, from meals to raising their children. Their life had passed through years of late nights working in the fields and early mornings tending to crops. They no longer had long evenings filled with conversation or shared laughter like they did when they were newlyweds. Their relationship had become mostly about the mundane tasks of life, brief conversations about the farm, and the ordinary things of daily life. Carl had married Susan right after they graduated high school. It was a practical decision in the eyes of their families and friends, not one born out of passionate love. They had known each other since childhood, grew up in the same small community, and getting married felt like a natural next step. Their relationship began with simple expectations: to build a family, have children, and maintain the farm. But over time, those expectations became burdens. Life became monotonous, and the joy in their love slowly faded. Carl wasn't someone who sought major changes in his life, but he couldn't deny the feeling of disconnection with his wife. They no longer understood each other the way they once did. Conversations grew fewer, and when they did happen, they revolved around farm work, the kids, and financial issues. Carl began to feel adrift, as if he were living in a marriage that had become a mere responsibility, devoid of love. As for Susan, she still loved Carl, but that love had worn thin over time. She believed that love between them was simply about taking care of each other over the years. But she didn't realize that Carl had changed. She didn't know that deep down, a part of him had died long ago, while another part longed for something new, a different kind of affection that he couldn't find in their marriage. Carl's life seemed peaceful, But the absence of true emotions in his relationship made him easily swept away by the undercurrent of feelings when he met Lily, the young woman who awakened him from the long sleep of his life. Although he didn't know where this relationship would lead, the feelings inside him had never been so intense. Carl and Susan's marriage began in their early 20s, just like many other couples in rural Iowa. It was more of a practical choice than a passionate love affair. They had grown up in the same small town, been friends since childhood, and after high school, marriage seemed like the natural thing to do. In the early years, they shared the simple joys of life, like taking care of the crops together, building a family, and watching their first children grow healthy. Carl was a hard-working husband, always dedicated to his work in the fields, while Susan was a diligent wife, keeping the home. But over time, things began to change. Carl's farming work started taking more and more of his time, and their evenings together grew silent. Susan no longer felt the affectionate gestures from Carl, who had become just a husband fulfilling his duties, while Susan became the mother and wife responsible for everything, but lacking the understanding and emotional connection. Their life, though free of major storms, began to feel dull and lacking fire. The fading of love came not only from the lack of time spent together but also from the growing differences in how they viewed life. Susan held onto the old values, trusting in the stability and peace of family life. She loved Carl in the way a woman can love a husband who has been a large part of her life. But Carl was different. He no longer felt the freshness, the excitement, that he once had. A sense of loneliness began creeping into his heart, even though he never said a word. Each morning he woke up beside Susan, he felt like a wheel turning in place. Nothing new, nothing to look forward to. Throughout these years, Carl never considered changing his life. He felt that he had reached a point where he couldn't turn back. Yes, family life no longer had the passion or romantic dates, but it was stable, a place where he and Susan could continue living with what they had built. However, as their relationship began to drift, when conversations no longer held depth, when their glances became cold, Carl no longer felt the connection. He felt as though he was living in an invisible silence. In a fleeting moment, he suddenly realized that he no longer looked forward to the simple things his wife did every day. The love and care Susan showed him were no longer the only things that made him feel whole. He wasn't sure if it was a lack within himself or simply an unmet need, but all he felt was an unexplainable longing. And then, when Lily entered his life, everything seemed to change. She brought something new to Carl, a spark, a new perspective on the world around him. His relationship with Lily wasn't the naive romance of his early days with Susan, but it had something that made Carl unable to turn back. He wasn't seeking a new love, but rather a sense of revival, a feeling that had been missing for years. He had never dared to share this with Susan, for deep down, he didn't want to disrupt the order that had been in place for so many years. But now, as his relationship with Lily began to blossom, Carl knew he was facing a difficult choice, one of betrayal that could change everything. In the late autumn days, as yellow leaves filled the roads around the farm, Carl felt that the years that had passed seemed like a clock that never stopped ticking, but each turn became more meaningless. He had lived with Susan for over 20 years, but now, the sense of connection between them seemed to have vanished. What remained were only daily routines, brief exchanges about farm work, children, and bills to pay. Their relationship had become as faded as a shadow, with no newness or passion. Carl wasn't one to openly express his thoughts, but inside, dissatisfaction had built up over time. He couldn't ignore the fact that their conversations had become dull, like exchanges of responsibility, not real sharing. Susan was still a good wife, caring for the family, but she was no longer the partner Carl could turn to for comfort or understanding. Their evenings together no longer held moments of deep conversation or even simple exchanges of thoughts and feelings. Instead, Carl felt the silence between them grow thicker. It seemed Susan hadn't noticed the changes within Carl. She continued to take care of everything as she had for years. She didn't notice the emotional void Carl was experiencing. Each day, she worked tirelessly from morning to night, worrying about the farm, the children, but never took time to understand her husband. And Carl, though he didn't want to admit it, felt forgotten in his own home. He no longer looked forward to affectionate gestures or evenings spent talking about life. Instead, everything seemed to have become part of an endless cycle that both of them just continued without acknowledgement. There was one evening, as they sat together for dinner, that Carl realized they no longer had conversations about anything beyond work or family. Susan, as usual, asked about the farm work and plans for the upcoming harvest. But to Carl, she had become a wife he couldn't connect with, someone with whom he could no longer find harmony. They no longer dreamed about the future together, nor shared feelings or unfulfilled dreams. Even their rushed kisses before bed had become routine rather than a gesture of love. Though he had never voiced it, Carl felt the lack in his emotional life. He no longer felt the happiness he once did when they first got married. Their relationship had become nothing more than duty and resignation, lacking understanding or empathy. He longed for something new, a feeling he couldn't find in his own home. And it was this lack that led Carl to Lily, a woman completely different from Susan, and from there, he was drawn into a relationship he never expected. Lily was the only person in all those years who made Carl feel change, even in simple conversations. She made him feel heard, cared for, and most importantly, she didn't look at him as just a farmer caught in the monotony of farm work. She saw him as a man with his own story, with his own emotions. Meanwhile, Susan no longer saw Carl in that light. That feeling of emotional emptiness had become a part of Carl's life, and it was this lack that led him to make a mistake he couldn't undo. It all began on a fall afternoon when Carl attended the annual farmers market in Des Moines. This was an event he never missed, not just for farm work, but also for the chance to meet old friends and farmers in the area. The market, with its booths full of produce, lively sounds from the vendors, and interesting displays, was always a chance for Carl to escape the quiet of the farm and reconnect with life, even if only for a moment. That day, as Carl walked through the booths, he happened upon Lily, a woman he had never seen before. She was standing by a small booth selling handmade goods, holding a woven basket and chatting with a friend. Carl couldn't help but notice her. Not because she was overly beautiful or alluring, but because there was something strangely captivating about the way she carried herself. Lily wasn't like the women Carl knew, wives, mothers, or women in his small community. She had a unique confidence, a freshness, something vibrant that Carl couldn't take his eyes off. Lily, in her early 30s, was a young widow. She lived in a town near Des Moines, where her main work was selling handmade products she crafted herself. She also had a young son and led a simple but energetic life. When Carl's gaze accidentally met Lily's, she smiled gently, as if she had noticed his attention but wasn't the least bit flustered or embarrassed. This made Carl feel different, as if Lily was opening a door he had never realized was there. Their first meeting was without any formal invitation or odd gestures, but the interaction between them was undeniable. Carl simply asked about the handmade products Lily was selling, and the conversation flowed naturally. They talked about farming, life in Iowa, children, and the simple things in life. But for Carl, it was something new, not because the topics were ordinary, but because of how Lily made him feel. She didn't seem like a woman exhausted by life, or just a mother who cared for her family. Lily made Carl feel that he, too, mattered, that he was a person with his own story and feelings. And then, during that brief conversation, there was a moment when their eyes met, a sensation Carl couldn't explain. For the first time in years, he felt a connection, even if it was only a fleeting one, between himself and this woman. That feeling wasn't the intense attraction he had experienced in his younger relationships, but something lighter, more natural, and full of promise. In the days that followed, Carl couldn't stop thinking about Lily. Every time he returned to his usual tasks on the farm, her image would appear in his mind, distracting him. The freshness and difference in the way she viewed life drew him in. Not long after, Carl decided to find an opportunity to meet Lily again. He visited her booth at the fair once more, and this time, they talked for longer, exchanging thoughts about interests, experiences, and life expectations. The connection between them began to grow. Though Carl knew he was venturing into dangerous territory, it seemed that nothing could stop the urge inside him. Being with Lily gave Carl a comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. Every time he met her, it felt like he was a new person, no longer the old husband and father, but a man who could love and be loved in return. And it was this feeling that led Carl into a romance he never anticipated. A relationship he began to hide and keep secret, yet couldn't stop longing for. The relationship between Carl and Lily gradually developed into an undeniable affection. At first, it was just brief meetings at the fair, but soon, these encounters became an essential part of Carl's life. He began looking for reasons to stop by Lily's booth, and each time he saw her, an indescribable feeling arose within him. Every conversation with Lily not only provided entertainment, but also a sensation Carl had never felt during his years with Susan. Lily, with her fresh perspective and optimism about life, made Carl feel valued and appreciated. She didn't see him as a man worn out from years of farm work. She didn't ask about the daily tasks or mention the responsibilities Carl carried. Instead, she asked about his emotions, what he truly wanted to do, and the dreams he hadn't shared. She made him feel that, beyond being a husband and father, he could also be a man with his own desires. That understanding and attention was something Carl hadn't received from Susan for a long time. Though Susan always took care of the family and was there when he needed her, she could never see the deep emotional needs Carl had. Susan never asked how he felt about his work or the changes in their lives. Each day that passed, Carl felt like he was living in a worn-out book, with no new chapters to open. With Lily, everything was different. She would take the time to listen to him talk about the challenges at work, the dreams he had never dared share with anyone. She understood that Carl was not just a hard-working farmer, but a man with his own emotions, hopes, and disappointments. When they sat together, talking about simple things like the early mornings on the farm or the beauty of autumn, Carl felt like he was coming back to life, not as a husband, but as a human being with emotions and desires. Gradually, Carl realized that he was not only attracted to the light conversations with Lily, but also to the feelings she evoked. She made him feel like the man he had always wanted to be, someone valuable, emotional, and with his own story to tell. The meetings with Lily were no longer just relaxation or entertainment, but moments where Carl truly felt alive. However, this feeling also created inner conflict for Carl. He knew that what he was experiencing with Lily was a significant change in his life, and although he didn't want to admit it, he couldn't stop. A sense of guilt began to creep into Carl's mind, especially when he thought about Susan. He knew he was deceiving his wife, but at the same time, he couldn't stop longing to be close to and loved in the way Lily had shown him. Carl's emotions became complicated. He couldn't deny that he was beginning to love Lily in a way he had never loved Susan. But this made him feel uneasy. He started to wonder whether these feelings were simply a reflection of the emotional void in his marriage, or whether he could truly build a real relationship with Lily. These questions didn't have immediate answers, but they made Carl feel more and more drawn into a situation that he couldn't easily escape. The feelings between Carl and Lily were a double-edged sword, bringing both a sense of vitality and freshness, yet filled with danger. Carl knew he was walking a path that, if not careful, would shatter everything he had built over the years. But at this moment, the happiness he found with Lily made it hard for him to see the situation clearly. These feelings became a powerful wave, pulling him in with no way to stop. A week after their chance meeting at the fair, Carl couldn't stop thinking about Lily. The feeling she gave him during their brief conversation lingered in his mind, like a breath of fresh air blowing through the stormy days of his life. He couldn't remember the details of the conversation, but the feeling of seeing her, the look in her eyes, that smile, the calmness with which she faced him, everything had been etched deeply into his mind. It made him feel an attraction that he couldn't resist. Carl knew he couldn't continue living in these vague thoughts. He needed to meet her again, needed to understand more about this woman, and more importantly, he needed to find a feeling that had been missing in his life for so many years. With this determination, Carl decided to contact Lily. He didn't want to make her feel like he was rushing things, but as he picked up the phone and dialed Lily's number, he felt his heart pounding. On the other end of the line, a gentle voice answered, and Carl smiled inwardly, feeling a little nervous. "Hi Lily, this is Carl. We met at the fair last week. Do you remember me? Lily laughed, her voice still as gentle as when they first met. Of course, Carl. How could I forget a man as experienced as you? So, what's up? Why are you calling? Carl felt a slight curiosity within him but tried to remain calm. I just wanted to invite you for a cup of coffee, if you're not busy. I'd like to continue our conversation. Lily was silent for a moment, then replied in a relaxed tone. I'd be happy to accept your invitation. How about we meet this weekend? And so, a meeting was planned. Carl, though a little nervous, couldn't hide his excitement. That weekend, he drove to the small cafe on the outskirts where they had agreed to meet. When Carl arrived, Lily was already waiting at a table near the window, the sunlight streaming through the glass, creating a warm and pleasant atmosphere. Carl felt like a new man as he entered the cafe, walking toward her. Lily looked at him with a bright smile, and in that moment, everything seemed to stop. He felt a strange connection, as if they had known each other for a long time. They sat down and Carl began the conversation. They talked about simple things like Lily's work, the handmade products she made, and Carl shared about the farm and the difficulties he was facing. But this time, the feeling wasn't like the meaningless conversations Carl had with Susan. The way Lily listens, sometimes with a subtle nod or a knowing smile, makes Carl feel as though he's sharing with a close friend. No judgment, no awkward pauses filled with meaningless questions. It's just a natural conversation, as if the two had known each other for a long time. Have you ever thought about what else you might do if you weren't doing this work, Carl? Lily asked, catching him off guard. Carl looked up, his eyes meeting hers. Actually, I've thought about changing, but I never knew where to start. I've just lived with the farm because it's what I know. And gradually, it's become my life. Lily smiled gently, her eyes seeming to understand his inner thoughts. Sometimes we need to stop and ask ourselves if we still love what we're doing. Change is possible, but you have to really want it. Lily's words stirred a strange emotion in Carl. He had never thought he could open up to anyone other than Susan. But with Lily, everything seemed easier. She made him feel accepted, not for what he did, but for who he truly was. The meeting lasted longer than Carl expected, and as they parted ways, he realized he didn't want to leave her. Every time he saw Lily, he felt a part of himself that he had long forgotten. She was the one who helped him rediscover the joy of living, and that made his emotions stronger than ever. The meetings between Carl and Lily became an essential part of Carl's daily life. Each time they met, everything seemed to light up, to feel fresh, as though all his worries and fatigue had vanished. Their dates became more frequent, no longer just simple coffee meetups, but turning into long evenings together, sharing stories about life, unfulfilled desires, and things they had never told anyone. Lily often invited Carl to small parties, gatherings in her community. These parties were unlike the ones Carl had attended before. They didn't just talk about work or family, but shared personal dreams, desires for life, and freedom. In these conversations, Carl began to realize that he had lost his way in life, that he had lost the freedom he had once longed for. He felt as if he were part of a new story, one where he could do whatever he wanted without feeling bound or pressured. On Friday night, after a week of hard work on the farm, Carl drove to Lily's neighborhood. He felt nervous yet excited. Every time he went there, it felt like entering a different world. A place where there were no worries about work or family, just him and Lily, living in private moments full of passion and joy. Lily greeted him with her familiar smile, and they entered the house together. This time, they didn't just sit and talk, but also prepared dinner together, cooked, and shared trivial stories. Carl couldn't recall all the details of that dinner, but the feeling of seeing Lily standing by the stove, laughing when he cracked an egg, made him feel a special connection. It was a feeling he had never had when working in the kitchen with Susan. When dinner ended, they sat on the couch, sipping red wine. In the cozy space of the small house, the soft lighting glowing, Carl felt his heart beat faster. Everything seemed to stop, leaving only him and Lily. This feeling was unlike anything Carl had experienced before. He wasn't just attracted to Lily's appearance, but to her gentleness, the deep understanding she offered. She didn't judge him, didn't expect anything other than for him to just be himself. Lily tilted her head, looking at Carl, and asked, "Carl, can I ask you something?" Carl looked up at her, a little nervous. "Go ahead. Do you regret what's happened in your life? Have you ever thought you could have done something differently?" she asked, her gaze gentle but curious. Carl sat silently for a moment, thinking about the question. It was true that he had thought about this many times, but he had never really dared to admit it to himself. He had lived a life based on what society and his family expected, and he wasn't sure he could change that. However, when he was with Lily, he felt as though he could do anything he wanted, including changing his life. "Yes, I regret it," Carl finally answered, his voice low but full of sincerity. "I regret not living the life I truly wanted. I've let opportunities slip by, emotions I should have cherished long ago. But now, I don't want to continue living in that regret." Lily smiled, her eyes full of understanding. She didn't say anything more, just gently reached out and took Carl's hand. The feeling of her hand in his felt like an affirmation that they truly shared a special connection. It wasn't just physical attraction, but a deep empathy, a kind of understanding Carl had never known in his life. This feeling made Carl feel as though he had entered a new world, one where he was no longer bound by the past or the responsibilities he carried. In Lily's eyes, he wasn't just a farmer who knew only work, but a man with emotions, dreams, and a deep yearning to be loved truly. This made Carl feel even more guilty towards Susan, but he couldn't deny that his feelings for Lily were growing stronger. One weekend evening, as Carl drove back from Lily's house, he felt a strong conflict in his mind. The guilt began to rise, taking over every corner of his heart. Even though every time he saw Lily, he felt alive, happy, the fear of what he was doing wouldn't leave him. He had betrayed Susan, the wife who had been by his side for more than 20 years. Together, they had built a life, raised children, and weathered many hardships. Yet now, Carl found himself standing at a crossroads, facing a difficult decision. All the sweet moments he shared with Lily couldn't erase the guilt he felt about Susan. The image of his beloved wife always lingered in his mind, even though he had grown distant from her over the years. Every time he saw Susan in their kitchen, offering kind gestures, asking about work and life, Carl felt like a betrayer. But when he was with Lily, everything seemed to change. He felt loved, cared for, and, most importantly, understood. Carl couldn't help but notice the contrast between the two women in his life. Susan, the one he had married and lived with for so many years, had become familiar and somewhat faded in his emotions. But Lily, with her freshness and allure, brought him the feelings he had long missed. They weren't just two people involved in an affair. Lily made him feel as though he were reborn, as if he were living a life he had always longed for. But at the same time, he realized that this love, although sweet, no matter how sweet his affair with Lily had been, it was still a betrayal. He was hurting the wife he had promised to love forever. The feeling of guilt haunted Carl in the following days. Every time he saw Susan, he couldn't hide the conflict in his heart. Part of him wanted to continue his relationship with Lily, but another part felt he couldn't face the truth. He knew that if the deception was exposed, everything would collapse. The farm that he and Susan had built together would no longer exist, and the family bond they had created over the years would be shattered. But Carl couldn't stop thinking about Lily, about the feeling she gave him. Every time he saw her, he felt like he was living in a new world where he could be himself, not just a husband, not just a simple farmer. There were nights when Carl lay awake, drifting through memories with Susan, but he felt he couldn't go back to the past. No matter how many beautiful memories there were, Carl couldn't deny that his life was now lacking in vibrancy. Lily gave him things he had never imagined, feelings he had never experienced. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this couldn't go on forever. The price of his deception was inevitable. Carl knew that if he continued his relationship with Lily, everything would eventually be exposed. And when that happened, the consequences would be a huge breakdown, not just for him but for his entire family. The children would never understand why their father hurt their mother. This pain wouldn't just stop with him, it would affect everyone in the family. However, each time he thought of Lily, the guilt would fade, and he couldn't help but wonder if he could live without her by his side. This internal conflict left Carl's mind in turmoil, and he didn't know if he had the courage to face the truth. This deception, while bringing him sweet moments, was slowly killing him from the inside. One October morning, when the first rays of sunlight touched the wet ground after a night of rain, Carl walked into the house, unaware that the truth would come to light that very day. He had always tried to hide his relationship with Lily, but some traces couldn't be concealed forever. That morning, as Susan walked past the table in the living room, she noticed an unfamiliar shirt, not Carl's. It was a new shirt, stylish in design, and Susan immediately recognized it wasn't her husband's. A feeling of suspicion rose within her. She picked up the shirt and glanced at it, wondering if Carl had changed his clothing habits. But no, Susan knew Carl would never choose a shirt like that. A sense of unease began to spread in her heart. She remembered the recent days when Carl had started acting strangely. He came home later, spoke less, and seemed less interested in the small details of family life like he used to. These changes couldn't just be a coincidence. In an instant, a painful feeling surged within Susan. She knew something was wrong. Her husband wasn't someone who easily hid things. She felt abandoned, not because of any particular reason, but because of the deception she couldn't yet fully grasp. The feeling tormented her, but Susan remained silent, not wanting to jump to conclusions. That day, when Carl returned home from a day's work on the farm, he sensed an unusual atmosphere in the house. Susan didn't ask about the shirt, but the look in her eyes couldn't hide her suspicion. She was trying to remain calm, but Carl could feel the tension in the air. He was too familiar with these signs. At dinner, while Carl focused on chewing a piece of beef, Susan stared at him intently, never looking away. She put her plate down and sat in silence for a long while. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but full of determination. "Carl, is there something you want to tell me?" The question made Carl's heart race. He knew the truth was about to come out. The secret meetings with Lily, the texts, the phone calls that couldn't be explained, all of it was coming to light. He hesitated, unsure of where to begin, but deep down, he knew Susan had already figured it out. She had discovered something. Susan didn't need to ask again. She had enough evidence to confirm that Carl's betrayal wasn't a misunderstanding. She looked him straight in the eyes, no longer the submissive wife but a woman in pain, disappointed. "You're having an affair, aren't you?" she asked, her voice choked. Carl could only nod, unable to say anything more. He knew words no longer mattered. Everything was exposed. Susan knew, and all the silence before was merely temporary concealment. She was heartbroken to realize that the man she had loved and shared a life with for so many years had betrayed her in this way. Susan said nothing more. She stood up, walked toward the door, and looked back at Carl one last time. "You're not just lying to me, you're lying to yourself," she said, then turned and walked away without saying another word. That was the moment Carl felt like everything was falling apart. He had lost the peace he once had in his family, and now he had to face the consequences that nothing could fix. His relationship with Lily couldn't be a lasting choice, and he realized he had lost too much. His betrayal not only hurt his wife but also made him lose himself. After Susan discovered the truth, a heavy atmosphere filled the house. No one said a word during dinner that night. Carl sat there in silence, unsure how to explain himself. The guilt surged in his heart, but he couldn't change the past. Any explanation seemed meaningless because the deception was already too clear. The next day, as the daylight filled the dim room, Susan couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. She didn't want to live in lies anymore. She called Carl into the living room, the place where for years they had shared family stories, the place where they had once enjoyed peaceful moments together. But today that room became a place of tension, a place for an unavoidable confrontation. "Do you think I'm stupid, Carl?" Susan snapped, her eyes red with anger. "You've been lying to me for 2 years, and you think I didn't notice? You think I'm not smart enough to see that you've changed? You've abandoned this family for another woman, someone you don't even truly love." Carl lowered his head, not daring to look into Susan's eyes. He knew he had done wrong. He didn't know what to say because any excuse would be meaningless. He could only stand there, overwhelmed with shame and regret. "I'm not a fool, Carl," Susan continued, her voice now filled with fury. "You've changed so much, and you might think you're making your life more exciting with Lily, but you've forgotten one thing. We have this family, we have children, we have a life we've built together. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed everything we had together." Carl felt like every word Susan said was a knife to his heart. He knew he couldn't argue because everything she said was true. He had lost everything, and now he had to face the inevitable consequences. Now he had to face the consequences. It wasn't just the loss of love, but the destruction of a family. He couldn't help but think about their children. How would they react when they learned the truth? "You can't imagine what I'm feeling, can you, Carl?" Susan continued, tears starting to fall. "I've loved you my whole life, I've sacrificed for you, for this family. And now I have to face the truth that you've betrayed me. You think I'll just forgive you easily? No, Carl, I can't forgive you this time. A sense of helplessness, regret, and pain overtook Carl's mind. He wanted to apologize, wanted to explain, but right now those words had no power. Everything was too late. His betrayal had made everything irreparable. What should we do now? Carl asked weakly, his voice dry. You know I can't live with you like this anymore, Susan replied, her hands trembling. I'll file for a divorce. And we'll sell the farm. How you want to divide the property, I don't care. What matters is I can't live with a man who's betrayed me. Susan's words felt like a sentence for Carl. He couldn't believe that everything he had built, all the memories they had shared, had been shattered because of moments of weakness, seduced by another woman. Carl could do nothing but stand there, looking at the woman who had once been everything to him, but now the woman he had hurt the most. In an instant, everything he had taken for granted crumbled. The farm, the family, the career, all could be taken away because of his lack of control. The cost of betrayal wasn't just regret, but an irreplaceable loss. When Susan left the living room without saying another word, Carl sat there, enveloped in his own darkness. Her words echoed in his mind, like an unbreakable curse. He had betrayed her, and now he had to face the unavoidable decisions. That night he couldn't sleep. Carl went outside, standing in the field, gazing up at the star-filled sky. The clouds lingered from the rain, but the sky was clear. The fields were quiet, no sound except the wind and insects. But in Carl's heart, everything was shattered. The farm he had worked so hard to build, the house he and Susan had lived in for so many years, now seemed to mean nothing. A heavy sense of loss enveloped him. Carl couldn't think of anything else but the consequences of his actions. Right now, all his feelings for Lily, the passionate afternoons, and the sense of novelty faded away. He realized that, even with his relationship with Lily, he couldn't live without Susan, couldn't lose the family he once had. But now, could he go back? Could he regain Susan's trust or his own? He thought of their children, a whole family shattered because of moments of thoughtlessness. How could he face them when they found out the truth? How would they look at him when they knew that the father they respected had betrayed their mother? The price to pay wasn't just losing his wife, but losing the trust of the people he loved the most. The next morning, Carl decided to talk to Susan one more time. He knew he couldn't hesitate any longer, couldn't live in denial and lies. He had to face reality, had to deal with what he had caused. When Susan entered the kitchen that morning, Carl was already sitting there, his hands on the table, his face tired and filled with worry. He looked into her eyes, no more avoiding, no more running. Susan, I can't change the past, but I won't let us lose each other, Carl said, his voice firm yet still filled with deep regret. I was wrong. I understand that. But I don't want to lose this family. I don't want to lose you. Susan looked at him, the pain still in her eyes, but perhaps a part of her also saw the sincerity in his words. However, the pain was too great, and the trust had been broken too deeply. Carl, you can't get back what's been lost, she replied, her voice gentle but certain. I can't forgive you this time. I'm done. I can't continue living with a man who's betrayed me like this. Carl felt like a hammer had struck his head. Everything he had hoped for had now shattered. He had nothing left to save, no reason to try. Even though he still loved Susan, the truth was he had lost everything. You want a divorce, don't you? Carl asked, his voice choking. Susan didn't answer right away. She was silent for a moment, as if struggling with herself. Finally, she said, We need to make this decision. I can't live in lies anymore. We're ending this. That was the final decision. Everything was over. Carl couldn't change the truth, couldn't change what he had done. And even if he wanted to, this relationship couldn't be healed anymore. The decisions in life might bring regret, but sometimes, that's the price we pay when we cross the boundaries of trust and love. Once Susan filed for divorce, everything in Carl's life began to change rapidly. The following days passed like a nightmare. The farm he had dedicated his life to building, once a source of pride and a symbol of a close-knit family, now became a burden. A sense of loneliness surrounded Carl as he realized that the large house was now empty, just him alone. Every corner of the house was etched with memories. family dinners, working the garden with Susan, the laughter of the children. Now it all felt like a distant past, leaving only pain in his heart. Carl sold the farm, a difficult decision he couldn't undo. The cost of betrayal was an irreparable loss. He couldn't hold on to that land, the place that had witnessed so many important moments in his life, because it was no longer his. Part of him wanted to hold on to at least a piece of the past, but Susan was no longer by his side, and the children didn't want to stay in the house they once had. This separation wasn't just the end of his relationship with Susan, but the collapse of a world Carl had once trusted. He realized that nothing could replace family, love, and trust. The farm had been sold, and a new life, full of challenges and loneliness, awaited him. Carl moved out and rented a small house in town. Every morning he woke up, feeling like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The long days working on the farm were gone, replaced by monotonous, tedious hours at a temporary job he had found. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt happy. The life he thought would be peaceful and stable now only felt empty. Lily, the woman he had found attraction and passion with over the past months, no longer contacted him as before. After the relationship between when the affair between Carl and Susan came to light, Lily distanced herself, unwilling to get involved with a man who had been abandoned by his wife. The feeling of failure and loneliness made Carl realize that those passionate moments with Lily were merely an escape from reality, unable to replace the values he had lost. His relationship with Lily was nothing more than a brief adventure, ultimately leaving behind only emptiness and regret. Calls from friends and family stopped coming. Carl knew he had separated himself from everyone. People cannot continue to trust someone who has betrayed the trust of others, and he understood that real-life relationships cannot be easily healed. All that remained was a costly lesson about deceit and irreparable losses. Loneliness continued to grip Carl every day. He realized that, although he once thought that infidelity could bring joy, in the end, it was just a sharp knife, severing all connections and hurting the people he loved. The loss was immeasurable, and the price he had to pay was inevitable solitude. Since the decision to divorce was made and the farm was sold, Carl's life had changed not only within his family but also deeply affected his social relationships. The sense of loss was no longer confined to his family circle but spread beyond, making him feel isolated among the people he had once known and trusted. Longtime friends and close neighbors, the people with whom he had shared meals and conversations, now seemed to have turned their backs on him. They didn't say it outright, but Carl could feel the coldness in their encounters. The story of his divorce and betrayal had spread quickly through the community. Even though the gossip didn't reach him directly, Carl couldn't help but sense the change in how people viewed him. Especially his old friends, they were no longer the same. The tale of betrayal and the broken family had spread fast. Meetings were no longer like before. Gatherings had lost their warmth. Instead of conversations about work, family, and happy moments, the atmosphere around Carl was filled with silence and even unfamiliar glances. He could feel the disappointment from those he had once considered close friends. In their eyes, he was no longer the person they had trusted but just a deceiver, a failure in the eyes of everyone. As for his children, though still young, they too could sense the shift in the family atmosphere. After the family broke apart, Carl could only see them during court-ordered visits. Those evenings when the whole family gathered around the dinner table had now turned into brief, cold exchanges in a living room of a house that Carl no longer considered home. When Carl saw the awkward glances from his children, he felt as though all the love he had given them was no longer enough to protect them from the invisible wounds that the divorce had created. His children couldn't fully understand why their parents were separating, but they could feel the sadness and the emptiness that the breakup had created in their hearts. Although Carl tried to explain that his love for them had not changed, the psychological and emotional distance seemed too great to close easily. Carl's relationship with his family members also became strained. They were disappointed in him, and even some relatives began to avoid him. Though no one openly condemned him, small gestures like silence during family gatherings or distant words showed that their trust in him had been severely damaged. This made Carl feel isolated and as though there was no one left to rely on. He had once been the pillar of the family, but now he was the one being cast aside and rejected. Carl himself was also fully aware that, while he might be able to repair a few relationships over time, the wounds he had caused would not be easily healed. People didn't just see him as a betraying husband but as a friend and a father who was not strong enough to protect the most important things in life. The more Carl saw the suffering of his loved ones, the more he felt the regret and emptiness in his soul. He couldn't regain the trust of Susan, his children, or his longtime friends. His relationships with everyone were no longer the same, and no matter how much he regretted, the mistakes of the past could not undo the wounds he had left behind. Deceit not only brought consequences in his family life but also shattered the relationships Carl had once considered solid. Now, all that was left was loneliness and regret, feelings that could not replace the immense loss he had caused. In the months following the divorce, Carl began to undergo a process of self-reflection, seeking to understand himself. Though he had acknowledged the serious consequences of his actions, he could not avoid feeling stuck and empty. Every day was a struggle with himself, a challenge in accepting that the decisions he had made could not be undone. The lonely hours were when Carl confronted his deepest emotions, something he had never allowed himself to think about before. He began to realize that, for so long, he had lived in a whirlwind of responsibilities, work, and daily routines but lacked real connection with the people who mattered most in his life. He had forgotten that, in love and family, sincerity, trust, and respect were essential elements. When he betrayed Susan and hurt those he loved, he had lost everything. Not just a family but also himself. The long nights in his small house gave Carl time to reflect. He started to realize that, although he could find pleasure in extramarital relationships like with Lily, it was just an escape from reality. What he truly needed was lasting love, a home where he could share joy, sorrow, and expectations in life. He understood that deceit and fleeting pleasures could not replace the solid values of family and true love. The feelings of regret and remorse not only caused Carl pain but also made him more aware of himself. He wondered why he had chosen a life of dishonesty and traded important values for short-lived moments of joy. Though he could not change the past, Carl understood that what mattered now was how he faced the present and future. He had learned that deceit did not bring long-term happiness but only left deep wounds that couldn't be healed. Now, Carl understood that life was not about flashy moments or fleeting relationships. It was about respect, loyalty, and true love. He had lost the most important things, but through regret, he began to see the values he had forgotten. He could not go back and fix everything, but at least he could start again from within himself with a new understanding of appreciating the simple and precious things in life. Although Carl no longer had the chance to repair his relationship with Susan, he decided to try to rebuild his life, not to regain what he had lost, but to create a new life where he could learn to love and respect those around him sincerely. He understood that sometimes loss is necessary for growth and for realizing the true value of life. Months had passed since the divorce decision and the sale of the farm, and Carl's life had undergone a noticeable change. Though no longer a husband and father in a happy family, Carl had started a new chapter in his life. However, loneliness still dominated his days. His job in town was far from what Carl had once dreamed of. As a farmer for many years, he had been accustomed to owning land, tending to it, and seeing the results of his labor. But now, the temporary and unstable work left him feeling aimless. Instead of waking up early on the farm to see the sunrise and hear the birds sing, he now faced simple tasks that did not bring any sense of accomplishment. Despite trying to adjust to this new pace of life, Carl still felt a lack of connection. He had moved into a small house in town where there were no children's laughter, no warmth of a family home. Every morning, he woke up alone and wondered if he could start over or if it was already too late. Almost all of Carl's previous social relationships had crumbled. His old friends no longer cared about him, and the neighbors kept their distance. He couldn't deny that his past actions had caused him to be isolated. Not only did his wife turn away from him, but the entire community seemed to view him differently. Those he once trusted were no longer the same. Although no one openly said it, Carl could feel the coldness and alienation in the way people treated him. Still, not everything had gone downhill. Although he couldn't mend things with Susan, Carl still tried to maintain a relationship with his children. Every time he saw them, even though they no longer lived together, Carl always tried his best to make up for the pain he had caused. These brief encounters, lunches, or phone conversations became precious moments that Carl cherished. He knew that, though he couldn't recover what he had lost, at least he could try to be a better father in the future. In his private moments, Carl also spent time reflecting on what had passed. He realized that, although he had lost everything, life still went on and he could start anew. Carl no longer sought forgiveness from others or hoped for sympathy from society. Instead, he learned to accept himself and his mistakes. This was a time for change, to live a better life, even if it was no longer the same as before. Loneliness was still an unavoidable part of Carl's life, but he no longer felt despair. He understood that he needed to reconnect with himself, and from there, he could build meaningful relationships in the future. Carl knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least he had begun to realize the true values in life. Carl sat in the small house, looking out the window at the empty field that no longer had the familiar hands at work. Although his new life had begun to stabilize, he couldn't shake the feeling of both liberation and regret. As everything around him changed, Carl wasn't sure whether he would truly find peace in his soul or if he was simply living with contradictory thoughts. A part of him felt as though he had been freed from the constraints, the pressures of a marriage that had lost love, had lost connection. His relationship with Susan had become a vicious cycle of exhaustion and deprivation. He had been trapped in a life without understanding and sharing, where true emotions no longer existed. When everything ended, Carl felt a sense of relief, as if a burden had been lifted. He no longer had to worry about the tension in his relationship with Susan, nor face endless arguments. However, another feeling rose within Carl, an irreparable regret. He couldn't help but think about what he had lost. The family relationship he had built over more than 20 years was now nothing but distant memories. The evenings spent gathered around the dinner table, the laughter of his children, the temporary yet warm conversations were no more. The regret about past mistakes not only caused him pain but also made him realize that deceit brought more loss than any fleeting pleasure. Looking back, Carl couldn't forget the times he and Lily sought each other in the dark, their secret meetings, and the moments when he felt as though he were living in a parallel world, completely detached from his family and responsibilities. He knew that those brief pleasures had clouded his judgment, making him forget the truly important values in life: love, loyalty, and sincerity. He had deceived not only his wife but also himself. Carl began to realize that keeping emotions hidden, taking dishonest actions, could never lead to lasting happiness. True happiness wasn't about escaping life's difficulties, but about facing reality, accepting mistakes, and learning how to fix them. Although Carl had started the journey to rebuild his relationship with his children, he knew it wouldn't be easy. The wounds were too deep, and the distance he had created couldn't be bridged immediately. However, in his regret, there was also a glimmer of hope. Carl understood that, though he had lost much, he still had the opportunity to start over. Not to return to the past, but to build a better future. He might not be able to regain Susan's trust, but at least he had learned a valuable lesson. Deceit was not just a mistake, but a wound that time could not heal. And although life was filled with things that couldn't be changed, finding sincerity and honesty with oneself was still the right step. Although regret still lingered in Carl's mind, he knew that he had found freedom from the burdens of lies. That feeling might not be completely pleasant, but it was a new beginning, a chance for Carl to live truthfully with himself and face the consequences of his actions. In the end, Carl sat alone, looking out the window where the weak afternoon light was slowly fading. The vast fields surrounding his small house were no longer full of life and joy. All that was left was emptiness and an irreplaceable sense of loss. After all the wounds, mistakes, and shocks from his broken marriage, Carl had finally learned a great lesson that he could not deny. Deceit not only breaks relationships but also destroys oneself. He understood that, during those long years, he had lived under the illusion that the fleeting pleasures from an affair could fill the gaps in his married life. But now, after everything had collapsed, he realized that it was the lies and lack of honesty that had destroyed everything he once cherished. He had once wondered if he could find happiness elsewhere, apart from family love, but now he had the clear answer. True happiness comes from building strong relationships, from being honest with oneself and with the people who matter most. Carl knew that although he had lost his family and couldn't change the past, at least he could learn from his mistakes to avoid repeating them in the future. He no longer sought compensation from fleeting things or dishonest relationships. Instead, he was determined to change, to learn how to love truly, and to appreciate the relationships that were essential in his life. He understood that deceit not only caused him to lose precious things but also led him to lose himself in the process. Carl's emotions were no longer desperate regret, but rather an acceptance that he had been wrong and was now on the path of repair. He may not be able to mend things with Susan, but at least he had recognized the value of love and loyalty. More than ever, Carl understood that what he had lost could never be regained, but he still had the chance to start over, to create a life he could be proud of with relationships he could cherish. The lesson Carl learned from all these painful events was that sincerity and honesty are the foundation of all relationships. Life may be full of temptations and challenges, but if we fail to appreciate what we have, we will destroy it all ourselves. In the end, Carl realized that to have a fulfilling life, he needed to live truthfully with himself and with the people he loved.